would appear in the brightness of the conversation that we have had enough for it. People have some other people joining us as we go. Let me return. When I come back to the comment that you made about Bikram Chaudhry, it's very interesting because if you read the histories of the yogis who have come to the West over the last century and a half, every single one of them sensed a great spiritual hunger. This was also what my Gurudev's master, Vanal Maharaj, told him. So their mission is to go to the West. And where Vivekananda had much more of a religious and spiritual mission, my guru was given the mission to pursue yoga in the West Hemisphere. And you're accurate to observe that very often in the process of doing that, there are some people who manage to sort of take yoga and either make a cash cow out of it in some fashion. Chaudhry is probably the worst example. And thankfully, he's doing terribly in court these days in all the different lawsuits of one kind or another that he's involved in. But as we said in our discussion afterwards, that this is one of the seductions on the path of yoga, and on the path of spirituality, whatever you may call it, is the pursuit of power. Whenever we wonder whether we're making spiritual progress, we start measuring things. How long can I sit in meditation? What complicated postures can I do? How long can I sit still? How long can I hold my breath? This sort of thing. And all of that has in it a subtle interest in power. Power has no place in the spiritual path, none whatsoever. You see these yogis who are such enormously powerful individuals. And our guru had the power to play with the laws of physics. And he often did crazy things with time, for example. I'll digress slightly and tell you a little story. One day in Minnesota, Swami Veda, while he was still a professor, had made an arrangement for Swami Rama to come and give a lecture at the university. And he had prevailed upon a colleague to create a venue for this. And so the lecture was to happen at 8 a.m. in the morning. So Swami Veda thought, well, okay, I should go over to his hotel about 7 to make sure that we get over there on time. Now, people were coming and seeing Swami Rama at all times of the day and night. And very often in a situation like this, you'd have to sit there while he talked to one person after another. And so he kept saying, just wait, just wait, just wait. Got to be 7:30, so we were worrying about the traffic. And Swami just saying, just wait, just wait, just wait. Sees 3 or 4 more people. Suddenly it gets to be 8 o'clock. And now Swamiji's really panicking because his reputation with this colleague is on the line here. So finally Swamiji comes, Baba comes and he says, okay, we can go now. And the whole way in the car, Swamiji inside is fussing or Dr. Arya at that time, fussing and fuming about how he's going to be late and there'll be nobody there and his relationship with his professor will be ruined. So they take about an hour to drive to the university, to get out, and here's the colleague at the back of the hall where they're going to speak, with a big smile on his face. Dr. Hardy thought, this is weird. We're so late, but he's smiling. I don't get it. So they get out of the car and they go into the auditorium where the lecture was to be held. Nobody there. So Swamiji thought, oh, everybody must have left. I'm so embarrassed. But also a little confused, so he asked his friend, I don't understand, there's nobody here. What time is it? And the guy said, 7:45. How did he do that? These so-called powers that a great master may demonstrate sometimes are not theirs. And any master that claims that power as their own run the other direction. No genuine guru would ever claim that power is his own. Because if they did that, the lineage would cut them off. And the punishment would be severe. There's a saying in the tradition, God and Guru are walking down the road together. Who do you bow to first? You bow to the Guru first, because the Guru introduces you to divinity. If Shiva is angry at you, Guru can save you. If the Guru is angry at you, nobody can save you. Nobody. And the lineage is fierce about this. They don't make accommodations with modern life. They don't compromise. If they are not understood the way they need to be understood, they simply walk away. And I was telling, what was her name, by the way?
Rishi.
I was telling Rishi that in the last 8 years, my guru gave me the adhikara to give mantra-diksha to people. And in the process of providing those initiations to people, I really have come to appreciate how much that stuff is not mine. And the minute I start thinking that way, my relationship with the lineage gets broken. As an example, well, I'll tell you a story about Swami Veda. And he had just been initiated by Swami Varma. He was also being trained to do diksha with people. And he was, as I said, a great interpreter of mantras of all kinds. And so he knew enough about mantras to have a lot of his own ideas about what somebody should use. And the process of giving a mantra initiation, you sit down, you do the meditation with the person, you create a common mind field that you both share. Then you go into a place in your mind that is the actual physical location of it. And in the presence of the Guru, you make a very gentle request for mantra from the person. And then you wait. And you wait until some mantra is given. Now in that process, I always have this little thing in my own mind about, is this coming from my mind or his mind? There are several ways that I know when it's coming from the right place. So you have to wait until that's completely clear, and then you give the mantra to the person, chanting into their right ear. So early in his career as an initiator, Swami Veda would give a mantra, and the person would get up off the seat and start to walk out, and he'd start to have doubts in his mind. Shouldn't I have given him this other mantra? No, this makes no sense to me. And these kind of thoughts would get going. The minute he would start to doubt, the phone would ring. He'd pick up the phone. Baba would be on the other end. You think you give the mantras? I give the mantras. Stop doubting. One time I was doing some initiations in Hungary, many, many people, like 17 people. That's a whole day's worth of initiation from 8 to 5. So we came to the last 2 people. And the last 2 people received the same mantra. So I started worrying in my mind. My mind starts going critical on me, thinking, oh, you just did that because you're tired. You're just trying to get off easy. It's this sort of stuff. So I worried about that for a while, for about 2 weeks actually, while we were on a silent retreat. After the retreat, the lady came to me and she said, you initiated my daughter 2 weeks ago. She was the last person that day. She actually said she was the last person. And she wanted me to tell you the following story. The night before the initiation, you came to her in her dream and gave her the same mantra you gave her the next morning. Now I guarantee you, I was not flying around hungry on a homestead looking to get into people's dreams. No, that was the guru using my face. And it's a beautiful story for that lady. But it was also a message to me from my guru that said, you don't give the mantras, I give the mantras, quit your worrying. So these days, because my guru is out of the body, sometimes, like a naughty boy, I start to worry a little intentionally just because I know I'll hear from him. I get a message. It's a way to keep in touch for me. But it's so clear to me, doing this now for some time, that whatever happens with that person in the process of initiation is nothing I'm doing. Nothing at all. It may come through me, it doesn't belong to me. It's not mine to give, it's not mine to take away. And that's the case with all of the powers that a yogi may demonstrate. Whenever people started to be amazed about the things Swami Rama could do, he would become like a 5-year-old boy. And he would say, I don't do anything, my master does everything. And this is a person who could transform matter from one form into another. But it wasn't his doing. Even though it was his practice. So, like I say, if you ever find yourself with a guru who claims that the power is his own or her own, run. Dangerous person. And I think keeping that attitude towards the tradition is really important. Swami Veda had all kinds of siddhi that we never saw. It was in plain sight. And he never drew attention to it. He always deflected attention from it. And yet, with the EEG, we discovered he was always in Yoga Nidra. One time we put an electromyograph on his muscles as he was giving a lecture. No muscle tension at all. It was a walking corpse. In the last few years when he was struggling with his health so much, I used to tease him a little bit and tell him he was my favorite zombie. Because he was walking this corpse around. He should have died 20 years ago, given his health conditions. He kept that body going for 20 years for us, which was such a gift. And there were all sorts of other things as well. Things we never saw. And they were there because he had that same kind of connection with his guru. My guru does everything, I do nothing. People would ask him, are you a guru? Are you a master? Or they'd call him a master. And he would, if you did that with him in public, he would chew you out in public. He would say, I am no master. I have seen a master. And I know I'm not that, even though his mastery of yoga was light years beyond what I could do. So, look for that kind of humility in someone. chances are they will be a genuine teacher. Other comments or questions? Yes.
Thank you, sir, for such a good lecture on dog rather. And food and astronomy seem to be my favorite subjects too, so we will share some things. I just wanted to ask, what sort of guidance do you receive from space, or like when you're in a setting on a one-to-one basis with the person, except for the mantra, like if it is intuitive, or how does that actually go about in practice? And second thing related or continuation is what sort of goal setting happens, or I mean, how does it actually proceed, or if there are any?
When I'm working with someone in therapy?
Yes, yeah.
My doctoral advisor was quite an innovative thinker about the process of therapy in many, many different ways. He taught a course in brief therapy. The process, the project that we had to do for the course in brief therapy was take two movies that you really like, take the beginning of one movie and the end of the other movie, and write the middle. That's brief therapy. Absolutely mind-bending person. One of the other things he said about therapy that I really respect is that part of the art of psychotherapy is being able to have a charming conversation with someone for a while until they present you with an opening. Now, what do I mean by an opening? An opening is a moment when all of a sudden you can see, number one, that the person has dropped their psychological defenses and that they're ready to hear something they might not otherwise be willing to hear or to do. The other part of it is that a little light comes on in your intuition and allows you to see that opening. I was working with a fellow with a serious narcissistic personality disorder. Fortunately, he was a much more pleasant person than Donald Trump. Very entertaining guy, actually. It was kind of fun to work with him. And he had had all kinds of struggles with depression and alcoholism. And he came to work with me in therapy. In his history, his father had died when he was 4 years old. And his mother had a pretty bad case of bipolar disorder, so she was unavailable as a mother most of his life. So he ended up becoming, even at the age of 4, the parent in this family. Became a parent to his mother and to his siblings, which meant that there were some real holes in his development of a sense of self. It was clear to me, even at the outset, that the important thing for him was going to be being able to get through, to make contact with, and then get through the process of grieving the loss of his father. However, he was marvelously defended on that part of himself. It took us 10 years. 10 years of charming conversation. One day, this was actually quite funny because he came in and he said, I got this pain in my back and it's making my fingers numb. And he was a composer and a pianist, so this is a real problem for him professionally. He said, I found this great book on the psychosomatic nature of back pain. And it so happened at that moment that I was having a horrible episode of back pain at the same time. So I said, oh, good, I'm interested in looking at this. Maybe we'll do this together. And as a footnote to that story, 95% of all back pain is entirely psychosomatic. It has nothing to do with discs. And if the doctor tells somebody it has to do with discs, guess what happens? Pain gets worse. It turns out that whole explanation is just a figment of physicians' medical imagination. 60% of all adults over 40 have ruptured or herniated discs and no symptoms ever in their life. So we finally got to the psychosomatic hypothesis with this back pain. During this time, he came in one day. I had asked him to look for pictures from his early life. Most people have a school picture taken every year. So I asked him to look for the school pictures. So he said, I found two pictures. I found one from when I was 5, and that one looked like a younger version of my client. Then he said, I found this other picture from when I was 4. He was a totally different boy. Completely different boy. His face completely changed that year. So I said, this is so different. This is from before your dad died, right? And he said, yeah, it was. So I said, okay. So I had him do a very deep relaxation. Actually, that was also a hypnotic induction. And I asked him to look inside for the boy that looks like that 4-year-old picture. And I did a thing with him called writing with a non-dominant hand. So I had him place a crayon in his non-dominant hand and put that crayon on a piece of paper that he was not looking at. And I said, if you find that boy, let anything that comes to you from him go into your non-dominant hand and move on the paper. So I put that in, soon the hand began to move, and then it stopped. So I said, okay, open your eyes, look what's on the paper. He had written his name in kid writing, and he was absolutely dumbstruck. The English term would be gobsmacked. He didn't think such a thing was possible. At that moment, I knew I had an opening with him. This was the opening that he came in 10 years ago to have. So then I said, okay, go back. Go back in, go to that person inside of you, and just say, here I am. What can I do to help? So he went back inside. His eyes began moving back and forth like they do when people are dreaming. So I knew that he was in contact with this younger version of himself. And pretty soon, you could see tears starting to form on the underside of his eyelids. This is a man who, in 40 plus years, had never allowed anyone to see him cry. So when the experience was finished, I asked him to open his eyes. And again, he was absolutely dumbstruck. And he said, I saw him. And he said to me, I've been waiting for you for so long, and I'm so lonely. And then tears began to come. And he wailed like a banshee for 2 minutes. This just convulsive grief. So finally, after 10 years, he could open his heart enough so that we could touch that primal wound in him. And allow that grief to make contact with his personality. Once that happened, he pretty much healed himself. That was the place where he was really stuck. And we only had 5 or 6 more sessions after that before we finished his therapy. So it was clear to me that that's what he came in to do 10 years before. And it took that long to get an opening with him. But sometimes that's how it is. Sometimes people give you an opening right away. That's wonderful. And And you can do really brief therapy. Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Other thoughts? Questions? Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for such amazing insight that you gave us into the field of neuroscience, biology to spirituality. Just mentioned that whatever is being done is not being done by the person, but by the guru. So I was wondering, like, even your guru said that it's his guru that is doing everything that's being done. So this, I guess, goes on back and back and back, and there's a guru behind every guru. So what is the ultimate force that drives people to do such amazing things and attain that level of spirituality as such? So,
It's called many things. It's called Chit Shakti, power of consciousness, which is another name for Kundalini, which is another name for Hiranyagarbha, which is another name for the Guru force. In Christianity, it's called the Holy Spirit. In Judaic tradition, it's called Ruach, the breath of God. It's that power of consciousness that moves through the world. That's why in all of the listings in the texts of lineages of gurus, at some point, there's always a boundary between historical people and mythological people. And actually, the people right at the boundary are very interesting, because I think these are, in many ways, some of the immortal yogis that still are there in the Himalayas. For example, Swami Rama's grandmaster, nobody knows anything about him. We know that he's Indian, that he lives in southern Tibet. He taught Swamiji the skill of Parakaya Pravesha, of being able to inhabit other bodies. He trained most of the contemporary meditation masters in the Tibetan tradition. Nobody knows his name. No information exists about this person. I suspect he may be sort of one of those people who exist in that interface between the historical and the mythological. Because all of these successions of gurus go all the way back to Brahma in the text traditions. Some people might say that mythological part is metaphorical. It's a way to explain the large expanses of time. That would be a nice academic, comparative religion kind of thing to say. But I think the reality is closer to being literal, in the sense that further back, some of those are definitely divine beings in question. And so that power of consciousness flows through them because they can move their psychological self out of the way enough for that flow to happen to a greater or lesser degree. And I think the same thing is true when you're a yoga teacher, because if you really surrender yourself at the beginning of a class, for example, whenever I teach, I did this afternoon before I started to speak with you. I drew circles of light around the entire class. I created a new bangla, a mind field, and I asked my guru to do whatever he wanted to do. And when you do that, things come out of you that you didn't know that you knew. Things flow from you. I had a lot of training in this by Swami Veda. I used to be a horrendous pedant. I would come into a lecture with a big sheaf of papers and a whole pile of books. And people would look at it and kind of groan. Oh my God, here it comes again. And over many years, he would send me into situations where I didn't know what I was supposed to be talking about. he would say, this is one of the ways that he used his illness. He would call me into his room at 5:30 in the afternoon. He usually gave a lecture in the evening at 8 o'clock. So 5:30, he would call me into his room and he would say, oh, Stoma, I'm feeling kind of sick today. You do the lecture tonight. He did this to me one time. I'm a halfway good Sanskritist. I have just a baccalaureate degree. So I'm a doctorate student at Sanskrit. So we're studying this Vedanta, we're studying Vedanta Sara with the Sanskrit commentaries. And commentary has always been difficult for me to read. So he said, why don't you teach the text of the commentary tonight and just come in, just sit down here for a minute, we'll take a half an hour, I'll go over it with you. Oh. So he went over it with me. I don't actually know how much of that I retained. And I sat down at 8 o'clock and I had no choice but to turn it all over. And I actually got through it. It was tough. But I actually was able to do it. I couldn't believe that. And that kind of stuff happens when you really surrender. Whether you're talking about giving a spiritual seminar, or doing an initiation with somebody, or teaching a yoga class, or working with a therapy client. It's that same flow of inspiration and creativity. That is the wisdom tradition across the board in all the different religious traditions. One of the interesting things in mantra science is that the bija mantra for the wisdom tradition, Aim, is the same bija mantra for Saraswati, for Stoma in the Tibetan tradition, Manjushri Buddha, the wisdom Buddha, Kuan Yin, Athena in the Greek tradition, Sophia in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Mary, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition. All of those have the same seed mantra. So these energies, these are just different energies. And they put on different clothes depending on what culture they're in. There's actually a mantra science in the texts of Kabbalah and Judaism that is almost exactly the same as the mantra science in Kashmir Shaivism. The same kinds of energies in the sounds of the alphabet. It's just phenomenal. So that power comes through every creative enterprise. So I think that's really where our power to heal comes from. And it's a great relief to not have to claim that as your own. It's a lot of responsibility. Sometimes, I don't prepare anything anymore. I definitely did not want to prepare anything this afternoon because I thought that something would evolve nicely in our conversation. And sometimes I sit down in front of a group of people and I don't have anything to say. I was in Hungary about a year ago. I flew over from the United States, and unfortunately, I had to fly a day later than I wanted to, which meant that I lost my rest day. So I arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I started doing some teacher training the next day at 9. I taught 6 hours a day for the next 5 days. Then I had a whole day full of initiations. Then I had a 4-hour public lecture. By the time I got to the end of the week, I was so exhausted. I sat down in front of that room. There was 100 people and a lot of students that I hadn't seen for a couple of years, so I didn't want to let them down. So I sat down, did my preparatory meditation, and I said to my guru, and I often speak to him in this way, I said, you got to do something here. I'm out of gas. Completely out of gas. I have nothing. Please. Please. I sat there quietly for a moment. A little idea began to bubble up. So I started following that idea. It evolved into a very nice flow. Things were really going beautifully. And when that happens, I can usually feel the lecture beginning to wind up 4 or 5 paragraphs before the end. So I was beginning to hear myself concluding. And I looked at my phone. 2 more hours. What am I going to do? So the old professor in me said. Any questions? Right? Total silence. 100 people. And then I realized they were so with me in this flow that they were all on the edge of meditation. So I said, oh, okay, I can see that you're all on the edge of meditation, so just close your eyes and let's sit for a while. So we did. We sat for 35 minutes. Total stillness, which was just beautiful. And they came out, and there were a few more questions. And I got through the 4 hours just fine. But, you know, I trust now in a way that I couldn't trust before. It takes a long time, a lot of testing, to be able to trust that that flow of Chit Shakti will support you. And I used to say all the time, test me all you want. Test and test and test and test. But when you finish testing, then you trust. You trust like a baby trusts. And not a small thing. People throw the word trust around all the time. And I actually don't believe in trust for adults. Because it's a black and white word. You either trust or you don't. And most relationships aren't like that. You can trust people, it's very gray. You trust people so far. I had an old lover that I tried several times and it just didn't work. And one of the things I learned from that is that I could trust that person in any financial transaction with any amount of money and know that I would be perfectly safe. But in the domain of emotional vulnerability, nada, nothing. So it's more about, most of the time in adult relationships, it's more about degrees of safety than it is about trust or not trust. Maybe when you've been together for 20, 30, 40 years, you've done enough experiments to really be able to trust. I think I'm at that point. But I'm old. And I do trust my guru. So much so that I don't worry when I fly. I have no concerns that a bomb is going to go off in some airport. Because if I'm really keeping the integrity of my surrender to the tradition, nothing will happen. Sometimes he even helps with lost baggage. I'm kidding you not. Even little things sometimes. So I trust. And I think that will gradually come to you as you learn to use that ability to surrender. Okay? Welcome. Other questions? Yes.
So thank you so much for the lecture. I came in, I don't know with what frame of mind, but a lot seeped in today. I have a lot of questions. So I'll begin. In the last comment that you made, you were talking about the fact that you need to surrender. Right? And when we began the lecture, when we were going through the guided meditation, by the end of it, the moment I opened my eyes, number one, I think it was a little prior to perhaps when you asked for it, I could feel heaviness in my head. So would that be, lack of surrender or something? I don't know. I want to understand how you would explain that experience, firstly.
Well, it could be some struggle inside about surrender. It could also be very often when there is some process of energy beginning to work in the Ajna chakra, people will feel heaviness in their head or headaches or fullness. That's a pretty common sort of reaction.
But the interesting thing was, as soon as you began talking, it evaporated. So it sort of went away very quickly. So I thought the heaviness I could feel, I thought it would perhaps stay for a little while longer. But the moment we got into the lecture, that sort of went away. The second thing that I wanted to say was that during the course of your lecture, you once commented on the fact that you need to, when you are in the process of psychotherapy, you need to be, you as a person heal the other person. So there has to be a relationship. So I am a student of Carl Jung. So in one of his traditions also, he talks about something very similar. When he says that, a doctor cannot take the patient any deep than he's gone himself. So that the moment you were talking about it, because my training comes from that sort of background, so immediately those things came to my mind. One more thing that we talk about in the Union School of Psychology is the concept of sacred space. Right? So there are certain spaces that we consider as sacred. Right? So I wanted to know from you, when you're talking about things like initiation, in the tradition that you follow, do we have a concept called something similar to the sacred space? For example, if I had to put it in this way, is it so that an initiation can happen at certain physical spaces but not at others? Or is it just the readiness of you and me that has to be there? The place in itself would play no role.
Empty policy in responding to either-or questions, the answer is always yes. Then I have to figure out how it's yes. There are two trends in the development of your mind. There's the samadhana trend, moving towards samadhi, and there's the vipassana trend, moving towards distraction. So I try to follow the samadhana path, and this is one of my old practices about that. Both things I think are true. Part of that process of creating a big bandhana, when I'm working with someone in therapy or as a yoga student, is the creation of a sacred space. I think whenever you exercise a compassionate relationship with someone, whether you do any formal ritual or not, you're creating a sacred space. And that sacred space isn't necessarily just a place. In the phenomenon of transference, for example, there was a Jungian analyst who was talking about transference one time, and he asked the audience, when does your relationship with the client begin? And people came up with the answers that you might expect when they walk through the door, when you first meet them. He said, no. The relationship begins the first time they hear your name. And that begins to create a sacred space within which the person consents to enter into this little drama of transference with you in a way that you can gradually help them to take their transference apart and to understand what the real relationship is apart from the transference relationship. So there's always a dual relationship going on there. And the work of therapy is figuring out which one of those is real.
So just one last question. Currently, I am, as per the records of the department, I am a research scholar here. But there is one question that has lingered on in my mind from a lot of years now. Because one problem that I personally have faced as a student is that I am taught a certain tradition. I am taught psychology, mostly Western psychology in Indian context. But I find myself really handicapped sometimes when I am putting it into practice. If I mentally had to go over, I've had numerous counseling papers, I've done a lot of things, I have been taught a lot of things. Perhaps there is some lacking on my end. I'm unable to find that application. The main thing that I wanted to know, the question that has lingered on with me for a long time, that if I am in therapy with a person, one thing that it emerged from one of the Gestalt workshops that I had attended, what happens because you have such a long experience in psychotherapy, if you have a patient in front of you who, for example, you talked about the patient who was dealing with AIDS. Right? So in that person's case, there is an impending death that is about to happen, right? Eventually. Or for example, if we change the example, if there is somebody in therapy who comes who has a terminal illness and who knows that there is a limited amount of time left in the body. Or if not the patient, somebody very, very near or dear to him. How do we deal with such situations in therapy? Because there are a lot of mystical and spiritual explanations available that I would agree to, perhaps you would agree to. But there are times when the patient himself or herself is so distressed that certain things cease to make sense to that person, because during the end of the time you're so desperately clinging on to the material things around you. You do not want to lose this material identity that we've created the entire life. So if I'm in this situation, what do I contribute as a therapist? What can I do to sort of bring that person out of this immediate so-called trauma that he's facing?
First question about how to deal with the ways in which you've been taught when you're actually sitting in front of somebody. Again, Brad used to have an interesting way of talking about this. Brad was a jazz musician. When he wanted to learn how to play jazz piano, he listened to a lot of piano jazz for about 3 months, and then he sat down at a piano and just started to play it. Another little manifestation of his genius. And likewise in therapy, you're learning a whole bunch of different tunes. You learn the psychoanalytic tune, you learn the behavioral tune, you learn the gestalt tune, you learn the cognitive behavioral tune. There are lots of different little tunes. What therapist in his or her right mind, Brad would say, is going to play the same tune over and over again for the rest of their life? When you sit down with somebody in front of you, you need to become a jazz musician. You need to forget the academic learning so that the music can come into your fingers and you can play jazz. You can improvise, you can put things together in your own way in the context where you live and work. And especially when you're learning to do therapeutic work with people in India, and you're learning the tools in an American context, you have to find a way to naturally bring those into an Indian context, to make them Indian. And that's jazz. The question about death and dying, well, the first thing is you have to help the person calm down, because they're going to be able to do nothing useful when their anxiety is very high. Richard was incredible. He had been so near death so many times. It was so funny, in American medical practice, there's a particular order that a terminal person can put in their chart that says, do not resuscitate in case there's a cardiac arrest. Just let me die. Well, he always had the DNR order in his chart, except each time he was admitted to the hospital, he would take it out. And then when he was discharged from the hospital, he'd put it back in. And it's probably a good thing, because he lived through quite a few crises. And each time, as he got sicker and sicker, one of the things that used to happen at that point in our ability to treat the illness is people would get prematurely old. Their bodies would just wear out faster than other people's bodies. Towards the end of his life, Richard's great-grandmother, who was 98 years old, could walk around the block twice as fast as he could. His body had suffered so much from the illnesses that he had. So gradually his life was shrinking. First he was confined to the house, then he was confined to his bedroom, then he was confined to his bed. Each time his life shrank, he found a way to be happy in that reduced life. It was amazing to watch. In the last weeks of his life, he sat there and used his cassette machine, because back then that was what we had. Any of you not remember what a tape cassette is? A little box with magnetic tape in it for doing music. And he would make tapes of his favorite music for everybody, and he gave me a set of these tapes before he died. I still have them. I can't play them, but I still have them because it's very dear to me. So part of the art of this is helping people to find their way to be happy with the constraints within which they have to live as they approach death. If you do a good job in your life of emotional purification. The term in yoga is chitta prasadana. And it's a very underrated practice, and a very important one. For most of us, the first 5 or 6 decades of our sadhana are about purifying our emotions so that the mind field is clear enough to go into samadhi. If you do a good job of that, gradually you become a more joyful person, a more loving person, a more friendly person. I had a friend who died a couple of years ago. It's a lady that I used to sing with. I participate in an American folk tradition of singing Christian hymns. And we sit in a square, and we all sing into the center of the square, and it's all loud all the time. There's no dynamics in the music at all. It's very powerful. It's the closest thing in Christianity that I've found to Hindu Kirtan. So one day, she sends out a message to all of the people in the group, and she says, my Parkinson's disease has now become terminal, and so I don't think I'll be able to come to singings so much anymore. But actually, that may not be a problem, because I also found out today I have stage 4 liver cancer, and I will not live long. Please don't think that I'm sad. Just come and sing with me. So that was an amazing email to get. I immediately replied and I said, there's some things in yoga that can really help when the time comes to leave the body. If you're interested, I'd be happy to come by and talk to you about that. And she said, oh yes, please. It sounds fascinating. So I went over, and after one of our singing sessions, we had a conversation. Here's how she began the conversation, and I always quote her precisely. She said, Stephen, I am so excited. I can hardly wait to die. What an adventure. Can you imagine to have that joyful in mind? I was living with this yogi. I had no idea. In fact, she died 5 days later. Just as joyful. And surrounded by loving people, even though she had had a very hard and deprived life. She learned how to be happy within those constraints. So I think what's most important as people approach the end of their lives is just our presence with them. Your ability to sit with them with an open heart, to listen, and gradually, somewhere in there will be an opening for you to do some jazz with them about dying. In Tibet, they have a very refined science of accompanying people into the experience of dying. It's called Hoa. And I have a friend in Austria who has an empowerment from the lineage holder of the Dzogchen tradition to do Hoa with people. She doesn't use the Tibetan texts because those are bound by a particular time and culture. But she just practices being a companion to the dying and is so brilliant at it that her course in doing this has a 3-year waiting list. She's an elder lady, she's almost 80 years old. I was talking with her about this one day, and she said, Stoma, every day I sit down in my meditation, I try to jump out of my body. Yesterday I almost made it, she said. So she's actually also kind of enthusiastic about reaching the experience of leaving her body. So it can be a joyful experience. It doesn't need to be full of grief. And if joy is there, then chances are your grief will be less. Because inherent in joy is also some compassion.
Thank you.
Actually, I can pause question. I don't know why I'm asking this, but what is the place of love and karma in the yogic tradition or the yoga psychotherapy?
Place of love and karma in.
In the, yeah. entire talk in whatever we were talking about so far?
It's always there. And of course, here, love is a very generic sort of word. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, they distinguish between other kinds of love and something called agape, which is selfless love, which is love without any sort of self-interest in it. It's purely a gift to someone. And I think that's always a part of the situation. I went to do a talk one time for a group of practicum students who were just doing their first practical work with counseling in a Catholic university. And they wanted me to give a talk about talking to clients about sex. Now this is a Catholic university. And at this Catholic university, the faculty are not allowed to do any kind of a course on human sexuality, which is really dumb if you're going to be a therapist. Because more than half the stuff I talk about with people has a sexual side to it. So I thought, oh my God, how am I going to do this in 1 hour with people? So I figured I would have to be a little provocative in my approach. So I got up in front of everybody and I said, how many of you love your clients? And the whole room went, because everybody in America is terrified about sexual harassment and sexual abuse charges and all this stuff. Everybody's all caught up in it. So the idea of loving your clients is really scary to people. There's another part of this if you're a therapist. I went to a workshop by a great family therapist, Carl Whitaker, one time, and he sat in front of this audience of about 1,000 people. It was provocative in a similar way, much more effective. And he opened his workshop by saying, you know, we're all whores. And you can see the anxiety flowing around the room, because this is every therapist's worst fear. We're all afraid that we just do it for the money, that we're selling our love. And if you put a price on it, and if you believe that you can help everybody who comes through the door, then maybe in reality you might be moving in that direction. Because you're not going to be able to help everybody, and it's important to be able to say so when that happens. And the business of money in therapy is also it's actually a fascinating and very deep subject, but a dangerous one, because just like with yoga, people get all wrapped up in money. And your work in therapy always has to be a gift to people, in the sense that you offer them the gift of this compassion, they offer you something in return to help you sustain your life. In my culture, you have to set a fee. You can't do the practice without doing that. But I don't think of it that way. And probably people would say I'm not terribly good about money. I don't care. Because it's a huge trap. I have enough income to be comfortable, and that's enough. I can sustain my life. But the important thing is to give that gift of compassion to people as a gift, even if they're paying you a fee for it. You have to think of that fee as a dakshina, as a gift from the heart. Okay?
So my question to you is, how do we as budding psychotherapists break through our own psychological defenses? Because we receive all kinds of orientations, we receive all kinds of learning and unlearning, and yet we're not able to break through our own psychological defenses. So I just wanted to understand how we could do that.
Physician, heal thyself. Cultivate your own self-compassion. Sometimes the best preparation for being a psychotherapist is to actually enter some psychotherapy. I think it's important for people who treat others to know what it's like to be on the patient or client side of the interaction. I did a personal psychotherapy for about 10 years. It was very helpful, very important. It taught me a great deal about how to do the work. It also taught me what it's like to sit on the other side of the relationship. And that's terribly important. There's a great neurologist who just recently left the body named Oliver Sacks. His books about neurology stuff are just fascinating. The title of one of his first books was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He wrote a story about his own recovery from a very serious injury called a leg to stand on. He had gone to Norway and he was going to climb one of the mountains over the beautiful fjords on the Norway coast. But he was pretty naive about trekking. So it took a long time to get to the top, and by the time he was coming down it was dark. He ended up falling off a cliff, and in the process of that fall, he avulsed his quadriceps muscle from its anchor above the waist, and in the process of that tendon being severed, the nerve was also severed, so he totally lost the use of that leg for a while. It had to be surgically repaired, and the nerves take a while to go back. So the whole time he was in the hospital, and he writes about his experience of being a patient, how different it is from how he looked at patients as a physician. Among other things, he said, as long as that leg didn't work, he couldn't even visualize what it was like to walk. He could not make a picture in his mind of walking because his leg was disconnected from his mind, which I think is just really a fascinating thing. And so learning something about the other side of the couch is really helpful, very, very helpful. And you can tell, I tell a lot of stories from my own experience. I do this with you and I do it also in therapy, just because I think it's more authentic that way. I had a very interesting thing happen at one point. There was a guy in the psych department at the University of Minnesota who was a really great psychologist. His name was John Brainerd. He had just been given tenure in the department. And he said at that time, there's enough unreadable stuff in the psychology literature already, I'm not going to add to the pile. He said, I'll do my academic work by lecturing. And he was a brilliant lecturer. And I greatly admired him. He was a big old hippie. He carried a watch that was always set to Greenwich Mean Time, wherever he was. He always took public transportation, he didn't own a car. He was never married, but he had a big house in a nice neighborhood in Minneapolis, so he always had a house full of students living with him. And he gave brilliant lectures on things like death and dying and bereavement, which was ironic actually, because on January 16, 1989, I opened up the paper to the headline that he had hung himself in his house. And I experienced such severe depression in response to this, you would not believe. Just immediately just sank. And I was in therapy at the time, and I happened to be in therapy with a close friend of his. So we explored this a bit, and at that point we came to the sort of standard interpretation that, what was happening was I was enraged that he did this, because a lot of his clients and his students were very much injured by his taking his own life. And so from that point onward, whenever I started talking about John Brandon, I'd get into my own outrage about this. At a certain point, I switched to a different therapist who was also a friend of his, even closer one. And it was a wonderful therapy relationship, and I knew that Philip loved me, no question. And one day, we started talking about Brandon, and I started doing this rage thing again. And at a certain point, he looked at me and said, "Stephen, this rage of yours is really odious." He was saying to me, "You stink." And I was shocked. I was traumatized in a very positive way. And in that moment of being brought up short, all of a sudden, out of my bones, all of this grief came pouring out, and I howled with grief for 10 minutes. I had no idea, I'd never cried like that before. Just making a tremendous scene. At the end of it, Philip and I both looked at each other, sort of went, "What was that?" In hypnosis, we do, you've heard of regression hypnosis, where we go back to an earlier time in a person's life. We can also do progression to create a model for your life. What I was doing with Brandon, unconsciously, was using his life as a progressive model for my life. And obviously my model got badly violated when it ended in suicide. I understood perfectly. And at that point, I could start to have compassion for him. He was 67 years old. He had recently been diagnosed with emphysema, which he knew very well was a horrible way to die. And he decided, I'm going to decide when I die. It still hurt a lot of people. And that was not okay. But I also understand what a human situation it was. And that was his best, the best he could do. Like with so many of us. And so I was able to forgive him and let go. And actually, in my own personal therapy, I only had about 5 or 6 sessions after that. That was the end of my personal therapy. Very interesting. So it gives you tremendous gifts. What I learned from that is what the psychoanalytic principle of containment means. When people are acting out their emotions in the relationship between me and them, if I can find a way to contain them, in other words, hold them in a sort of quasi-parental way, then they can do what the analysts call regression in the service of ego. They can go back to the unhealed younger person in themselves and give themselves the compassion that they could never get in their life up to that point. And then they heal very quickly. It's often the critical moment in therapy. So it's a beautiful way to learn that principle. So now, it's not just that I can tell people what it is, but I really know it. I know it in my own body. And I think that's the kind of thing that some experience with therapy gives you. That's why in training for psychoanalysis, you have to undergo training analysis. Same thing in psychoanalytic psychology of Carl Jung. And I think really it's just a good principle in general for people who want to do that kind of work. Because you learn about what compassion really is in your own body. Other thoughts?
So do you
Microphone?
So do you think that the therapist or the healers, they need to have a training, or there is something called that it can be initiated through divine or something?
Well, there are some people who are sort of natural therapists. But most people need some most people need some training. And part of the reason for having training programs is that in the process of creating a licensable profession, this word professional is very interesting. I used to teach a course in ethics and professional issues in psychology. And so in the first class, we would take the word ethics and the word profession and try to figure out what the deep structure of that was among all the people in the room. And of course, when you use the word professional, all sorts of associations come out with status, with income, with all those sorts of concerns. But the word in English actually means to make a vow. And the vow that you make is to provide some kind of expertise to the public in exchange for the public supporting your life. And that's really what it means to be a professional. And so in licensing a profession, you have to be able to guarantee some minimum standard of competence. And so in that regard, I think the training programs are important for establishing the public image of a profession. In the mental health professions, our reputation as a profession is based on two things. One of them is compassion, and our ability to genuinely use that to help people heal. And the other thing is our determination to protect their privacy. And this sometimes creates conflicts with the law. It's a very important principle. And so when things come up, for example, in the legislatures in the U.S. that threaten to invade those relationships and the privacy that we try to protect, we're pretty vocal as a profession about that. And that's, I think, a good thing.
Okay. Maybe last or maybe one more, that's about it. We're running out of time.
So you talked about progression. How does that work? You've all heard about progression and that itself is very fascinating. But how does progression work? Secondly, you also mentioned how important emotional purification is. For therapists, as individuals, it's extremely important for each and every person. And can you just elaborate upon how do we purify our emotions as therapists and as individuals?
The last question is a huge one, and I'm just finishing a book on this subject, so I probably have too much to say to be useful. Except that for most people, that process of emotional purification is the real task for the first many years of your sadhana. Because the mind field has in it many warps and knots. As you all know from the Samkhya philosophy, the subtler layers of the mind field control the grosser layers. So, for example, your Manomaya kosha shapes the flow of energy in the Pranamaya kosha, which shapes the conformation of your physical body. And so, for example, the way a mantra works is to change the structure of your mind, which changes the structure of your prana system, which eventually then changes your body. So the work of our early years in sadhana is unknotting our mind, getting free of the conditioning of the mind field, so that energy can flow smoothly. Because when spiritual awakening happens with people, when the Kundalini energy is catalyzed, we're not talking about a little tickle in your spine. We're talking about the entire potential energy of the macrocosmic universe coming through you. And when that happens in a complete way, it can be really intense. And when Kundalini is awakened, if you haven't done the preparations, she will complete those preparations for you with tremendous force. Swami Muktananda was given such a complete awakening by his Guru Nityananda. And for the next 3 months, he would be sitting in his meditation, he would pick him up off the ground and throw him against the wall of the house. Or he would suddenly snap into asanas, mudras, and bandhas and actually injure himself. He once went into yoga mudra so forcefully that it lacerated his forehead. So these kinds of very powerful experiences come sometimes with a very intense awakening. Now thankfully, most of us will experience that as what the yogis call krama mukti, sequential awakening, step-by-step awakening. And so the process of emotional purification allows for that awakening process to be as peaceful and as joyful as it can be. Because particularly in my tradition, when people think of, because Swami Rama in one of his identities was a Swami, people think that our tradition is just Advaita Vedanta and Shankara is Advaita. But actually, at its core, our tradition is much more based in Kashmir Shaivism. And in particular, in the Shakta Upaya of that tradition, in the means and methodology of raising people's awareness up through processes of initiation. Through the direct access of the Guru to your mind, pulling your mind upwards. So, it's important to prepare yourself for that. And that's, I think, really the most important short thing I can say about emotional purification. The book should be out within the next 6 months, so I'll be sure and send you at least a copy soon. What was your other question? There's one other.
You mentioned progression. How does that work?
Oh, yes. Hypnotic progression. Well, in the same way that you place somebody in a trance and have them sort of run the movie backwards to when they were younger, you can also have them run the movie forwards to when they're going to be older and begin to create a mental model for what that life should look like. And it can be a very helpful thing to do, for example, with people who have serious experiences of abuse in their history. You can go back to that younger person in them and explain from your adult self that it gets better as you get bigger. And you can tell them as an adult, what they need in order to be able to heal as a child. Then you can use that to help to create a future model for what they can become. And that's the concept of it. Obviously the technique of it is a little more complicated and requires some training, but that's the basic idea.
So that really means that our minds have some inherent, even if it is at some subconscious or unconscious levels, but it has information about what our life is going to be 20 years from now.
Let's say what it can be. Is going to be depends partially on you, but it also depends on the circumstances of your life too. But you can create a general framework.
I'd like to ask. Go ahead. Your question, I have no question, and that's it.
Hello sir, thank you for your talk. I'm Lord Jelson from Tibet, studying this department. I have 3 questions specifically. And you talk about surrendering yourself towards the Guru. Is this concept similar to the taking refuge and seeking refuge in Buddhism and Buddhism in general? This is the first question. And the second question is, have you ever received Kala Chakra initiations? And if you received, and how was the experience?
I haven't done the Kala Chakra practice, no.
Okay. And then third question is, you talked about the Dzogchen tradition, little bit Dzogchen. And is there any relationship between Dzogchen tradition with Indian yoga in general and particularly the Patanjali Yoga? This is my question.
Yes, the tradition of Dzogchen is much more like the Sparsha Yoga of Gaudapada's Mandukya Upanishad commentary, and also the sort of tradition of Sahaja Yoga, of, there is a sort of sudden enlightenment tradition in part of the Advaita tradition. The text that comes to mind is Ashtavakra Gita. And there are some others as well. It's also called Manasaka Yoga, mindless yoga. So those are some related traditions in the yoga tradition. Interestingly, when he received his initiation from Swami Rama back in 1969, one of the things that Baba said to him at that moment is, our task, you and I, is to prepare the way for Maitreya, Buddha to come. So you can't think of Swami Rama as being just Hindu. He was brought up in Indian Hindu culture, but there are also parts of his training that are Buddhist, that are Christian. Many of his Upagurus were actually Sufi peers. So it covers an enormous range of traditions. And so I'm very interested in the Buddhist path. And for example, when we had a whole bunch of students come from Taiwan and Thailand, when we have Buddhist students, we give them Buddhist mantras. When we have Christian students, we give them Christian mantras. So we try to teach people from within their own tradition, in the tradition that I follow.
I've always wondered how different therapists or people in schools thought dealing with clients who have a disability, something which they can't fix, and how to find joy and happiness